Before we start, thank you for watching. If you enjoy these forgotten weapons stories from World War II, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps us uncover more of these remarkable aerial innovations. Today's story is about a deadly combat problem that American carrier airmen faced in June 1942. A problem that existing dive-bombing aircraft and tactics were struggling to solve against the most powerful carrier fleet the world had ever seen. This is how they found their answer. June 4th, 1942. Somewhere over the Pacific, an American dive bomber pilot squinted through his windscreen at empty ocean. His fuel gauge dropped steadily toward the point of no return. Somewhere below that horizon, a Japanese carrier fleet was hunting what remained of American power in the Pacific. If he and his squadron couldn't find those carriers first, the war might be lost before America truly entered it. The situation facing the United States Navy that morning represented the most desperate gamble in American naval history. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy remained virtually unstoppable. Their carrier strike force had ravaged everything from Hawaii to Ceylon, destroying Allied naval power across half the globe. Now 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steamed toward Midway Atoll, their decks packed with the same aircraft that had crippled the Pacific Fleet. American commanders knew this attack was coming, but stopping it was another matter. The U.S. Navy mustered only 3 carriers against Japan's 4. 2 had been rushed from Pearl Harbor with battle damage. The aircraft were a mix of modern and obsolete. By mid-morning on June 4th, every American attack had failed. Torpedo bombers were slaughtered without a single hit. Land-based Army bombers hit only ocean. Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft guns shredded the attackers, leaving the enemy carriers untouched. In their hangars, aircraft were being armed for a counterstroke to finish the American fleet. American commanders had played their hand and seemingly lost. But high above, unseen by Japanese lookouts, carrier-based squadrons were finally closing. The tactical problem facing American naval aviation in 1942 was how to sink an aircraft carrier moving at 30 knots, defending itself with fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Level bombing from high altitude had proven useless. From 20,000 feet, a carrier was a tiny sliver, and by the time bombs fell, the ship had moved. Army B-17 Flying Fortresses had dropped hundreds of bombs on Japanese carriers since the war began and hit nothing. The mathematics of high-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships simply didn't work. Torpedo bombing offered better accuracy, but required approaching at wave-top height in a straight line, a perfect setup for slaughter. At Midway that morning, 41 torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers attacked. 35 were shot down. The survivors scored 0 hits. Japanese Zeros descended on the slow, low-flying Devastators, which were already obsolete. The planes lumbered through hails of 25mm and 7.7mm fire, burning before they could release. Those that survived watched their torpedoes run erratically or fail to detonate. It was systematic annihilation. The Navy needed an attack combining accuracy with survivability, something that could hit a maneuvering target from an altitude that kept aircraft above the worst flak but allowed precise aim. The answer was dive bombing. Instead of approaching level or low, dive bombers would climb high, then roll into near vertical dives directly above their target, releasing at low altitude. Gravity accelerated the aircraft to tremendous speeds. The near vertical approach meant ships couldn't maneuver away. A carrier might dodge sideways, but it couldn't dodge down. The high-speed dive also made interception difficult for fighters and kept the bombers above most light anti-aircraft fire during the approach. The theory was sound. The problem was the aircraft. American carrier dive bombers in early 1942 were slow compared to enemy fighters, making them vulnerable during approach and climb-out. As a defensive armament was minimal, typically 1 or 2 flexible mounted machine guns for a rear gunner, useless against determined fighter attacks. The aircraft available at Midway, some already considered obsolescent, carried this burden. Their radios were unreliable, with several squadrons losing contact. Their bomb sights, adequate in training, had to be used under combat conditions no peacetime exercise could replicate. With anti-aircraft shells bursting around the cockpit, the fighters diving through the formation, and smoke obscuring the target. These complex machines operated in the most demanding environment imaginable, carrier decks pitching in ocean swells and salt air corroding every surface. More critically, dive bombers struggled with range. A carrier aircraft needed fuel for the outbound flight, combat, and return, with enough reserve to find a carrier that had moved since launch. At Midway, this problem nearly proved fatal. Several dive bomber squadrons launched based on estimated Japanese positions. Arriving at those coordinates, they found empty ocean. Fuel gauges dropped as pilots searched desperately. Some squadrons turned back, fuel exhausted. Others kept searching, knowing they might not have fuel to return even if they found the enemy. The morning attacks also revealed a crucial problem: coordination. Doctrine called for coordinated strikes, torpedo bombers drawing fire low, fighters suppressing enemy air patrol, and dive bombers hitting from above while defenses were distracted. But synchronizing multiple squadrons from different carriers across hundreds of miles of ocean proved nearly impossible with 1942 radio and navigation equipment. The torpedo squadrons attacked alone and died, their sacrifice buying time but achieving nothing tactically. When dive bomber squadrons finally located the Japanese carriers, they faced a defensive gauntlet that had already destroyed nearly 40 American aircraft that morning. Japanese carriers bristled with anti-aircraft guns like the 25mm Type 96, which could track aircraft through a dive, and 7.7mm machine guns for close-range defense. The carriers maneuvered radically, heeling into sharp turns. Above, Zeros from the Combat Air Patrol circled, waiting to pounce on any American aircraft that survived the dive. The dive bomber pilots understood their tactical problem. They had to climb to between 14,000 and 19,000 feet, burning fuel and exposing themselves to fighters. They maintained formation on approach, making them predictable. The dive itself subjected airframes designed in the 1930s to tremendous stress. Plummeting at over 250 knots, pilots had to aim, while calculating for target movement, wind, and dive angle. They had to release their 500 or 1,000-pound bombs at precisely the right moment. Too early missed, too late, and the aircraft might fly into its own blast or hit the water. And they did all this knowing that fighters would be waiting when they pulled out, slow and vulnerable. Previous battles had shown these problems. At the Coral Sea in May 1942, American dive bombers damaged the carrier Shokaku, but failed to sink her. They sank the light carrier Shoho, but only after multiple hits from both dive bombers and torpedo planes. The lesson was clear. Sinking a fleet carrier required precise hits with heavy bombs. At 10:20 hours on June 4th, 1942, the tactical situation appeared grim for the United States Navy. Torpedo squadrons were devastated, fighters scattered, and Army bombers ineffective. Japanese carriers remained untouched, their crews preparing a counterstrike. The planned American attack had disintegrated into chaos. The intelligence had provided the opportunity, but execution was failing. What American commanders needed was already airborne, though they didn't know if it would arrive in time. They needed dive bombers that could find the enemy, pilots with enough courage to press attacks through heavy fire, and bombs heavy enough to cripple carriers. Most critically, they needed these dive bombers to arrive at exactly the right moment. Timing was everything. Arrive too early, and Japanese fighters at altitude would shred them. Arrive too late, and the Japanese counterstrike would be airborne, leaving American carriers defenseless. The torpedo bombers' sacrifice had drawn Japanese fighters down to low altitude, leaving the skies above the carriers temporarily open. The Pacific War hung on this convergence of desperate elements: obsolescent aircraft flown to their performance limits by pilots navigating across empty ocean, searching for an enemy fleet that had destroyed everything sent against it. They carried bombs that needed direct hits to be effective, facing fighters and anti-aircraft fire that had already killed dozens of American airmen that morning. The United States Navy had gambled everything on this attack. If it failed, the Japanese would control the Central Pacific, possibly forcing negotiations and delaying American offensive operations for a year or more while the Navy rebuilt. And somewhere above the clouds northeast of Midway Atoll, running low on fuel, American dive bomber pilots were still searching. The aircraft that first rolled onto flight decks in late 1940 looked deceptively ordinary. A low-wing monoplane with a rounded fuselage and large greenhouse canopy, its fixed landing gear gave it a workhorse appearance. Carrier crews watched skeptically as the newcomer, with perforated dive flaps folded flush against its wings, appeared almost docile. Mechanics swarmed the unfamiliar airframe, running hands along riveted aluminum skin. Pilots climbed into cockpits that smelled of fresh paint and hydraulic fluid. The rear gunner faced aft through a ring mount for twin .30 O caliber Brownings, a position with a commanding view but little protection. With a 1,000-pound bomb on its centerline displacement gear, the aircraft sat nose high, its gear compressed under the heavy load. None two forward-firing .5 O caliber machine guns protruded from the cowling, but the real killing power hung below, a single massive bomb designed to swing clear of the propeller. During training flights off the California coast, squadron leaders demonstrated near vertical descents. Pilots reported the aircraft held together without flutter or vibration, withstanding crushing deceleration forces. When extended, the perforated dive brakes created a distinctive howl as air screamed through the holes, a sound that became its signature. What looked ordinary on the ground transformed in a vertical dive into a stable bombing platform, giving pilots the time needed for accurate delivery. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was America's answer for carrier-based precision strikes. Measuring 33 feet long with a 41-foot wingspan, the two-seat dive bomber married rugged construction to practicality. Its Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engine generated 1,000 horsepower, driving the Dauntless to a maximum speed of 255 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. Combat radius was over 770 nautical miles, giving carrier task forces significant reach. The airframe incorporated perforated split dive brakes to prevent compressibility effects, a displacement crutch to swing the bomb clear of the propeller, and a wing structure engineered to withstand pullouts exceeding 6 Gs. The armament consisted of two forward-firing .5 O caliber Browning machine guns in the cowling and twin .3 O caliber guns on a flexible mount for the radio man gunner. Maximum bomb load was 2,250 pounds, though missions typically carried a 1,000-pound bomb on the centerline with two 100-pound bombs under the wings. The design prioritized structural integrity over speed, built to survive damage. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate, and all-metal construction allowed it to absorb punishment. It was built for carrier operations, with folding wings, a robust arresting hook, and tough landing gear. Production began in 1940, with models entering fleet service as training intensified in 1941. The Dauntless entered combat after Pearl Harbor, when American carriers were the primary offensive weapon. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, SBDs from Lexington and Yorktown proved effective, executing high-angle dives through anti-aircraft fire to sink the light carrier Shoho. The battle confirmed the tactic of using torpedo squadrons to draw down combat air patrol, allowing dive bombers to attack from altitude. This lesson proved decisive on June 4, 1942, when Dauntless squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown launched against the Japanese fleet near Midway Atoll. Navigation errors scattered the American formations, and torpedo squadrons suffered catastrophic losses attacking piecemeal. But their sacrifice drew Japanese combat air patrol to wave-top height, leaving the carriers undefended above. Enterprise pilots, low on fuel after a long search, spotted the Japanese fleet. What followed was 5 minutes that changed the war. Pushing into near-vertical dives from 14,000 feet, Dauntlesses plunged toward Akagi and Kaga, their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. Their perforated dive brakes howled as airframes shuddered under the strain. Bombardiers tracked the carriers through bomb sites, compensating for evasive turns. At 1,500 feet, the pilots pulled out against crushing G-forces, and the displacement crutches swung 1,000-pound bombs clear of the propellers. The bombs arced toward flight decks packed with fuel and ordnance. 3 bombs struck Akagi, one penetrating the deck and detonating among armed aircraft. Secondary explosions and ignited aviation fuel turned the flagship into a wreck. Kaga took 4 direct hits, her flight deck erupting in flames. Yorktown's squadrons found Soryu, leaving the 3rd carrier burning. In 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were destroyed by Dauntlesses that endured the brutal attack. The Dauntless faced serious operational challenges. Its modest speed made it vulnerable to interception by fighters like the Mitsubishi A-6M0, especially when withdrawing from a target. Crews maintained tight formations for mutual defense, as stragglers faced grim odds. The R-1820 Cyclone engine's reliability was marginal in the Pacific. Suffering from high oil consumption and occasional failures, the rear gunner's exposed position offered minimal protection, making it one of the most vulnerable crew posts in carrier aviation. Range limitations forced careful mission planning, as fuel reserves were often barely adequate. During the Guadalcanal campaign, SBDs operating from Henderson Field suffered maintenance issues from tropical humidity, corroding control cables, and degrading hydraulic seals. The aircraft's low speed also made it a poor strike escort. By 1943, as Japanese anti-aircraft defenses and fighter tactics improved, dauntless losses mounted during strikes against well-defended targets. Production reached 5,936 aircraft between 1940 and July 1944, when the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver superseded it. The type served with distinction throughout the Pacific, from 1942's carrier battles to the island-hopping campaigns of 1943 and 1944. What's Marine Corps squadrons flew land-based Dauntlesses during Guadalcanal, providing close air support and attacking shipping throughout the Solomon Islands. Navy squadrons from fleet carriers struck bases across the Central Pacific, including the Marshalls, Marianas, and Philippines. Wartime analysis credited SBDs with sinking more Japanese shipping tonnage, including carriers, battleships, and cruisers, than any other Allied aircraft. It participated in every major carrier engagement from Coral Sea and Midway to the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. As newer SB-2C Helldivers replaced it in 1944, many pilots preferred the Dauntless for its superior handling. The SBD flew final carrier missions over the Philippines in early 1945, and Marine squadrons used it for close air support at Okinawa until the war's end. Post-war, some served with the French Navy in Indochina. Several examples survive in museums, with restored aircraft flying at airshows. The tactical problem American carrier forces faced in 1942, delivering heavy ordnance accurately against maneuvering warships defended by fighters and anti-aircraft fire, found its answer in the Dauntless. The aircraft proved that structural integrity, diving stability, and bombing accuracy mattered more than speed in carrier warfare. Pilots trusted the airframe to survive the brutal physics of near-vertical dives and crushing pullouts. This confidence translated into the precision delivery that turned the tide at Midway and pressed the attack until final victory.